Book of Ruth. We're going to cover and finish, and I did not bring sheets. Things have been a little hectic, but we will cover the book of Acts. I'm sure it'll be chapter 1. We've done these a few times now. I can almost tell you where the format is, almost. But we'll cover book of Acts starting next week. Everybody's familiar today that we're going to stay through the afternoon if we're staying. Sunday school, second hour church service, and then we'll go down to eat, and there's some good food waiting down there. You want to stay. And then we'll go after that. We'll come back upstairs. Okay, how many read Ruth? Some portion. 1, 2. Okay. Book of Ruth, very familiar, I think, to a lot of people, at least in segments of it. And what's interesting is, of course, as we covered a couple of weeks ago now, Judges kind of paints a very dark picture of what it meant to live in Israel in that time, because God was dealing with them according to their works as a nation, as a people. And in Ruth, what we see is God working with people through them despite the conditions. And this was continual. When God enacted in Israel to do this or that, as far as being overrun by the enemy and such, there were decent, godly people in the middle of that were negatively affected. In America today, the lawyers would have a field day suing God, or trying to. It's that sort of thing. You think of the captivity, carried off. Who was carried off among that? Daniel and his 3 friends. They suffered for it, their parents. I have no doubt but that Daniel and his friends' parents were godly people. You know, was it acorn doesn't fall far from the tree? Parental influence. And so here we see then in Ruth, it gives the time placement very generally. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. So it's the time of the judges. Somewhere in there, it would have been well before the end of Judges, because there's also people's names at the end that we'll get to. But there was a famine, and this person, for very reasonable cause, said, I'm taking my family over to Moab. Now, the Moabites were descended from Lot. In Genesis there, remember God judged Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness, for their perversion, rape, child molestation, underage girls. Oh, yeah. That was Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot got out with his 2 daughters, that's it. His wife left, but she looked back, she was turned into a pillar of salt. I've actually seen studies where they say, yeah, if you had these kind of conditions, yes, you would get that effect. That's basically chemical generation, that sort of thing that caused the change. Anyway, turned into salt, has just his 2 daughters. His daughters have children. Those children are the then ancestors of Sodom and of Moab and Ammon, 2 constant problems, but they were essentially cousins. Oh, by the way, Moab was instrumental. Remember that part about Balaam wanting to curse the children of Israel as they were going toward the promised land and listening to the local kings and actually influencing nations to come after him? Yeah, that was Moab involved in things. They were not friends of Israel, even though they were genealogically kind of close related, because they were, down in the far south, they would be, oh, that's my cousin. You know, yeah, well, how are you related? Well, my great aunt's second son-in-law's third, yeah, okay, over that way somewhere. They were related. But Moab cared nothing for the things of God. They were raised without that. And so they didn't follow the Lord, even as Israel was coming close to them. I'm going to read from, if I can find this then, Deuteronomy. I'm having trouble with my markers. Deuteronomy 23, no need to turn, it's there. If you want these references later, let me know. Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, an Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. In other words, this was a continuing thing. You had to get past that 10th generation. You know, they do these genealogical studies, and you're, 2% this and 3%. Yeah, okay. Who raised you? Who influenced them? But for genealogical purposes in Israel, this was important. 10 generations back was how they looked to determine who could go into the congregation. That was decided by male descendancy, and that's key, because this is going to come up at the end. So who was your dad, who was your dad's dad, and go on back. 10 generations before, oh yeah, your people, I think we've bled out all of the paganism. Of course, Israel was not following God very well either. We need to set up all this so that you understand what is going on here and why there is such a big deal. They go to Moab. Notice the last part of verse 1 of chapter 1. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah. Bethlehem, in Judah. Yeah, he's of the same hometown as Christ, born in Bethlehem to Mary and Joseph. Why were they traveling from elsewhere to get to Bethlehem? Because that was their hometown. And basically there was a famine, bad times. God was judging them in that time. Probably a famine because they were at that time being overrun by the enemy who was messing with their food, taking it, running off with it. Times of the Philistines, I would assume that was when that was particularly a problem. And so they left, went to Moab. Verse 3, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. Dad's gone. She had 2 sons, verse 5, and Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. They all passed on. Tough times. So she decides to tell her daughters-in-law, oh, by the way, the sons were married, it does mention. She's telling them, look, you just got to go back. I've got no way to do anything here. This area is going to do nothing for me. I need to go back home. Verse 8, and Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. Understand, those daughters-in-law also helped with the funeral arrangements for the 2 sons. Now, in telling them to go back home, understand the Moabites were idolaters. They did not follow God. She's telling them, go back to your mother's houses, go back to your idolatry. God bless you. Yeah, not exactly the ringing advice, like really good advice at all. So they head out, she heads out. Verse 13, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? She's saying, am I going to have children? Well, she probably wasn't. And how old would they be and how long until they're old enough? And yeah, that's not happening. Would ye stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. And mind you, 1, the Lord was working through all this anyway, despite the appearance of it. 2, if her husband and her sons hadn't died, she would have stayed there. But it was very important that she didn't stay there. She needed to be back in the land of promise, in the land of Israel. Moab had its land, and it could keep it. but they needed to be back in God's will for their lives, and they were not. And so she sees it as God hates me. No, God was looking at what the leadership was from the men and what had been done, and then what did she need to do? Well, while they were there, it wasn't going to change. But notice last part of verse 14, last 4 words. Or as our president would say, the last 3 words, but never mind. Ruth clave unto her. Now, that's nice. She didn't want to go home. Yeah, go back to my mom. Nah. The other daughter-in-law did go back. That's in verse 14. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. And then notice Ruth's testimony. These are 2 key things. First of all, her spiritual attitude, and then her outlook on life. Verse 16, 17. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. She trusted God. She understood, maybe better than Naomi did, that God was a better God than any of those idols that her family followed. She had trusted God, I have no doubt. That is a major decision on her part. Verse 17, look at this, the resolution in this, the determination. Where thou diest, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. Wow. She'd just as soon die as go back to her mother. That's a determination. She's made an absolute decision. The decision to follow God truly is a very conscious decision. It is not a, well, we've always done this. Okay, good. Why? The breading goes inside or outside of the turkey. Does it matter? Oh! That would be the decision on the other part. On this part, no, I would rather die. That's major. That's a conscious decision. A preference even to the point of, I just don't care to eat it then. Okay, sure. More for me. But this was a very conscious, hard, this is where my life needs to go. This is the direction I need to take. So verse 18, when she, meaning Naomi, saw that she, meaning Ruth, was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. Doesn't mean she turned the cold shoulder, but just, I'm wasting my breath. Okay, we're going. You and me, let's go. They get back to Bethlehem, verse 19, and in verse 20, after everybody in town says, it's Naomi, she's back. Well, she had raised 2 sons old enough to marry and then died. And verse 20, and she said unto them, call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. Naomi, by word meaning, means pleasant, and Mara means bitter. We see that word also in the Pentateuch, where they found bitter waters, Mara. But if you notice the rest of the book, what is she called through the rest of the book? Naomi. She's recognizing the condition there. God has other plans. But she gives that same testimony, verse 21. And I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty, in verse 21 there. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me? And I have mentioned that, again, it was the big picture that was involved here. She was looking at the conditions she was in, which were hard. But it was passing thing, not a permanent, ongoing thing. And it does mention verse 22, it was the beginning of the barley harvest. Beginning of barley harvest. There was food. And apparently it was going really well. Key point, again, Ruth. Spiritually, I'm following God and the people of God. That's just how it is. Chapter 2 and verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. This was barley harvest. There's certain words in the Hebrew they translated corn that it might not have been what we recognize as corn. They were talking gathering up the bundles of grain and that sort of thing. But here's the key point in this. Ruth says, I'm not going to sit around here and mope. There's work to be done, and it ain't going to be you. You're the, senior person. They didn't have long lives back then, shorter than ours. And she would have to be the one to see to that. She was going to go out. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading out of the Old Testament, but the key point in Israel, by law from God, that mean harsh Old Testament law. No, it was a very good civil law. It serves as a good example of what God wanted for them, and the civil law would do well for us to notice too. It's practical. And the key there was when they gathered crops, they were to intentionally leave the corners, the edges of the field unpicked, so that the poor could go through and work and gather up food and have food to eat. Now, they had their property based on genealogy. They weren't paying tribute to anybody for that in the time of the judges. It's a nice thing about having volunteer government that just, goes down to do their job, and they have other things instead of sitting there going, I need more money, my rent just went up. No. People had their own homes. They went and gathered. They took care of these things. It was very practical. So they would gather during the harvest time and have food. Wouldn't say to be perfect, but it was workable for them. And so she went out. Verse 1 in chapter 2, though, I'm going to back up to that. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth and of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Very important. Boaz. Pronounce it Boaz, not Boaz. Okay? This is not Bo's hog or somebody. Okay? The very opposite. So verse 5, Boaz notices her and asks, last part of verse 5, whose damsel is this? Okay, this girl, she just wandering off the street. Who is she? Well, understand, they lived in tribal groups then. This was the tribe of Judah, and then by families probably in much the same area, though there might be then a little more blurring of, like a hard line. But they would have specific sections of property. Verse 7, he meets with her. And she said, this was before what the reapers were telling him. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. She went in probably, middle of the day when the sun was up. And, I've got to sit down for a little bit. Where do you get water? Where can I draw some water and have a little something to drink? And then she went back out. This was later in the day then, apparently. So Boaz goes to her and makes a point of it. She just happened on that point. She just happened to go to a place where, this guy's a relative. Verse 9, let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And he's saying there, they're not going to give you any trouble. They're not going to get in the way and say, don't come too close. While we're reaping, we're still reaping this area. No, she's fine. In fact, if I don't read it, later on he says, let her take it off the wagons if she wants. If she's working faster than you are, that's your problem. Just make certain you draw what you're supposed to draw for me, But don't trouble her. You keep moving faster than she does. I think that's the big thing. So he tells her that. Verse 10. Then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? She noticed grace, mercy, openness, willingness from authority. And so he stands as a source of grace, God's providence. And she recognized that. She saw that in him. Look at verse 15. We'll read that. And when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, Let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. He recognized, he knew who she was, and it's like, she's just about, cousin, maybe she was, maybe second cousin, close family. Let her be sure to have enough food. Mentions she had an ephah of barley in verse 17. That, I'm told, is about 3 pints. I don't know how much, well, maybe with a little water and, make soup of it or something like that. It's a little something extra. Didn't gather a lot. Verse 20, And Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, The man is near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. Very close. This is important. 2 things. One, Naomi recognizes God's blessing. God is blessing me now. This is better. We're now walking where God can help us, and we're getting that direct effort from Ruth's effort in the field. Also, in that tribal heritage that they were given of God, if there was a circumstance where, Ruth didn't have children, she essentially owned the land for the family, all by herself. Whatever was Elimelech's, the grandfather that, didn't have any grandchildren, died, that land was now hers. And the Old Testament law did take note of if somebody had a situation where the patriarch of that particular group, that family, had no sons, then the daughters carried that. That's, believe it or not, there's a chapter in the Pentateuch about that. It was that detailed. Anyway, chapter 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee? And now is not Boaz of our kindred, with whose maidens thou wast, in other words, you were. So his womenfolk would have been instrumental in that work, along with Naomi, along with the men that were seeing to the heavier labor. And so she was right along there with them. Verse 2, and this one I'll just cover very briefly, but let's read verse 2. And now is not Boaz of our kindred, with whose maidens thou wast? Behold, he winnoweth barley tonight in the threshing floor. Who was at the place, the mill, where they ground all that down and broke out the seed and took care of packaging it up in nice, nifty little bags? Well, Boaz, the owner. And he would have been there with the men who were working with him. He would have had company. This is key. And there's something similar to this I'll mention also, but just to draw the picture, he's not by himself. Now, if you read that, we're not going to take the time constraints. We're doing 2 lessons in 1 week. Do you understand? So I'm moving a little quickly. But Boaz is there along with everybody else. They're sleeping on the floor. They're bivouacking. It's harvest season, and for farmers, that's how many hours can you put in? You got to get it in now or it goes bad. That's why life can be rough in Russia, because their harvest season, their land is kind of geographically vertical, And so it's a very short season. It goes across that. And all of it, as it's coming through, has to be harvested very quickly. So they're sleeping on the threshing floor in the mill. And by their custom, she was instructed to go in and basically lay on his feet. You know, like the family dog. You wouldn't be anywhere near that, would you? Case in point from history. David, in his old age, had trouble keeping warm. So one of the maidens of Israel, a girl, was sent to him to keep him warm. She laid on his feet. He was an old man. You know how it is. You can't sleep if your feet are cold. I have two blankets, one for a blanket and one for just the feet. Get feet warm. Okay, now I'm good. Nose cold, another problem. Anyway, the whole point here was just that she's saying, I'm petitioning you. And he understood that. So we get down to verse 12. And now it is true. He's talking to her, Boaz talking to her. I am thy near kinsman. Howbeit there is a kinsman nearer than I. This is important. Again, nearest kingdom. There's kinsman. The relative nearest had the right to offer to take the land that had belonged to them. No problem. So, but Boaz says there's one nearer. Chapter 4, we're going to move along. Verse 1, Then went Boaz up to the gate and sat him down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by. Verse 3, And he said unto the kinsman, Naomi is come again out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land, which is our brother Elimelech's. Last 4 words of verse 4, I will redeem it. Oh yeah, I'll take land. Give me some land, you know. I'll sign for free land, yes. Why is Oklahoma the state of the Sooners, the Sooner state? Because they're the ones that got there sooner when they opened it up. Yeah, I love that clip. Somebody actually had film them chasing the stakes they thought they would get, the land stakes, where they would settle. Crashing carts or something. He's perfectly happy to take the land. But then, verse 5, Then said Boaz, What day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must also buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess. Uh-oh. She's from Moab. Your children won't be welcome in the congregation, meaning in the temple immediate area that the men would be allowed to, for 10 generations. Well, that's if you're male, really. We'll see that. And he's looking at that and thinking, yeah, no, we're blue blood. I can't do that. Verse 6, And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar mine own inheritance. And again, a picture here. What we saw earlier from Ruth, identifying Boaz as being full of grace there. Well, not full, but his grace to her. They draw a picture, and I think it's a very good picture. We've been studying Romans on and off on Wednesdays, I think it was. We've gotten away from that. We're covering Nehemiah now. But this kinsman who's closest is the law. The law can't redeem. The law can't mar its image. It's absolute. You break one point of the law, you've broken the whole law. It's not going to budge. By the law came the knowledge of sin. Boaz then, in that picture, I'm not saying it was, I'm saying in that picture, that illustration, he stands as Christ. Grace. Whosoever. Arms wide open. That sort of thing. So you've got a very definite picture here. The law cannot save. The law cannot redeem. Christ redeems. Christ saves. So then Boaz agrees to that. Verse 9, and Boaz said to the elders and unto all the people, ye are witnesses. Verse 10, moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Moran, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. And understand this, by the genealogy, of course, this was Boaz's son that they would be talking about there. But by that, what he was doing was raising up not his inheritance to own that land, but that his child through Ruth would own that land. You know who ultimately owned that land? David's family. Jesse, his dad. That was the land. How do I know that? Last part. Mentions verse 13, he took her to wife. Verse 18. Now these are the generations of Pharez. Who's Pharez? Well, you got to go back to the last part of Genesis, one of the last chapters. This was the son of Judah. They're taking it right up from the son of Judah. Very interesting genealogical thing here. Pharez begat Hezron. Okay, Hezron begot Ram. And Ram begat Amminadab. And Amminadab begat Nahshon. And Nahshon begat Salmon. Well, there's a name for you. Coincidence. Why is that name Salmon so important? Matthew chapter 1. It follows the descendancy of Christ. Spells it a little differently because it's from Greek rather than Hebrew, but it's the same names. Nahshon begot Salmon, and Salmon begot Boaz. Spells it with two O's, but it's Boaz. Of Rahab, and Rahab begot Obed of Ruth. And so we're back here with that same genealogy. Boaz begot Obed, don't know who he is. Obed begot Jesse. Oh, okay, I recognize that name. Is it the same Jesse? And Jesse begat David. We got the same names. So understand, why did Boaz have no problem with it? Because his mom was Rahab, the harlot that had provided the spies with the ability to go into Jericho, spy it out, and get out of there. He's like, hey, I love my mom. Oh, she's a Moabitess? I don't know what your problem is. And then through that, the great-grandson was David, a man blessed of God to have that genealogy that would lead to Christ, the eternal king for Israel. And so God's blessing, God providing in the middle of all that darkness, and that's key. This was a light in God's work in that. Would anybody notice in that day? No. Naomi would realize that she was having a better day of it. That's what she noticed. But greater by far, God's working in them through that descendancy to bring Christ into the world through David. That descendancy mattered. God has a bigger plan for things. His grace extends to all, but we have to walk in his light and his plan to have that blessing fully. And even then, this is a wicked world, and our bodies betray us. Don't have to explain that to this class. And we need to be aware of that yes, there are struggles because Adam and sin. But we can expect God's blessing if we're in that land of promise for what he has for us. Right? Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your counsel, for your word, for the examples of godly people of the past. Lord, may we be mindful of what your blessing means and that it is always there, your hand always extended, if we will meet you in the path that you have for us, Lord. We look for your blessing in this in Christ's name. Amen. So we will cover Acts chapter 1 next week, and I'll have sheets for you then for the chapter sequencing.